Hello, everyone. Welcome to eLearnChat, where talk is knowledge. I'm Dirksen, and here we go. Hi, everyone, again. Welcome to the show, and we've got a great one for you today, and we've got Dawn back. Hey, Dawn, how are you?
Good day to everyone. I'm well, thank you. Happy spring.
Happy spring. Well, you're almost in spring where you are.
Yeah, I guess it is in spring for Jeff when he watches this show, but for most everyone else, it's spring.
That's true. That's true. He's actually in fall. He's in Australia, for those
right.
wondering.
Opposite season. Hey, Jeff, happy fall to you.
And today we've also got with us Julie Dirksen. Hey, Julie, how's it going?
Hello. Good.
Hi,
it's going well. It is actually spring here, but it's only been spring for about 3 days, but we're still pretty excited about it.
We're keeping it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Being just 3 hours or so from you, we're keeping it.
Exactly.
Well, Dawn, would you like to introduce Julie?
I'd love to. I have met Julie a couple different times and have enjoyed watching her do presentations and, more importantly, enjoyed the side conversations that we've had. So welcome, Julie Dirksen of Usable Learning.
Thank you.
Welcome to the show. Leva just joined us.
And actually, Leva I could have had her in the office today. She's with us for 2 weeks.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know.
She's visiting, and we left early. We got up at 5:30 this morning, so we let us sleep in a little bit.
Oh, good. I didn't know. I would have figured out a way to find her. Maybe we still can work that out.
Well, Julie, tell us a little bit about the book you wrote.
The book, yeah. So I have a book that I've written called Design for How People Learn, and it's really intended to be sort of a good first book for people. One of the things that I had noticed is that there were a lot of books out there that kind of talked about here are the steps that you follow when you're designing learning, but not necessarily all that many that were getting into, and here's why you do these things, so that people could kind of have a deeper understanding. And so many people wind up doing teaching or doing learning design because they have a lot of subject matter knowledge. They know a lot about customer service, or they know a lot about web design, or they know a lot about, electrical installation. And people say, hey, you're a good customer service rep. Why don't we have you train the customer service people? And so because so many people come to the field via subject matter knowledge, one of the things that I thought would be useful would be to have a really good sort of accessible resource to kind of help people understand some of the underlying principles, because one of the things that happens with learning is you get a lot of cargo cults, which is this idea, this sort of metaphor from World War II. I first heard about it in a Richard Feynman lecture. But one of the things that would happen in World War II is on some of these Polynesian islands, the U.S. Navy would roll in and they would, immediately put in an airstrip. They'd pave a strip of land in the jungle, they'd put up towers, they'd put on headsets, they'd put up windsocks, and then all these planes would show up and all this great stuff would arrive. And so there were native populations apparently who would see this and go, well, that seems like a pretty good deal. And they would pave a strip of land in the jungle, and they would put up towers, and they'd put on headphones and windsock, and they'd wait for the planes to show up. Yeah, and so that happens in education a lot, and that happens in learning environments a lot, where people are like, well, I've been in classes and I'm pretty sure there's somebody at the front of the room and they have slides and they talk about stuff, and so I will do something that looks like that. But what they're actually doing is creating something that has all the sort of surface appearance of an educational experience without any of the real kind of foundational understanding of the underpinnings that allow an educational experience to be good. And it's kind of like not really understanding the fundamental reasons that the planes are showing up. And so that's what the book is kind of about. It's designed for how people learn, and it's taking a lot of the kind of fundamental principles of educational psychology, but translating them into, I think, what's hopefully a very accessible book. It's written in a really conversational tone. I have stick figure drawings, that kind of thing, so that anybody can pick it up and read it, but get some real sense of what some of the really important things to consider are when you're designing learning environments or designing learning experiences.
So really that comes down to what everybody's been complaining about in the industry, that there's a lot of people are thrown into a situation of having to teach without really any background in either teaching. Even a lot of instructional designers, they can write the training many times, sometimes they can't, but they're not used to actually teaching in many cases, or they're not used to teaching certain materials. So, or doing graphics or doing audio, things that it's kind of outside of their level of expertise. And with our economy and everything else, everybody's been thrown into, okay, let's make the most mediocre learning we can because that's all we can afford.
Right. Well, and to be fair, I mean, particularly people who are actually, come up through an instructional design background. Mm-hmm. Instructional design as a field kind of came out of things like World War II and the government model, where they wound up drafting a bunch of people and then said, oh, shoot, we have to train them now. Let's find a systematic way to do that. But what it means is that the entire field is based on a series of process steps. First you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And, there's kind of a lack of actual design guidelines. I know when I went to graduate school for instructional technology, I learned a lot about analysis. I learned a lot about evaluation. But when it came to the design part of it, was just like, the instructions were things like design the intervention, which is sort of the equivalent of saying, and magic happens here.
Right. My wand isn't working.
Right. And there are actually very few good kind of like, if you find out this about your audience or your content, here's an effective intervention that you can use, or here's some effective design principles. And while we certainly borrow stuff over from educational psychology has some different concerns than we usually do kind of on the more adult workplace side. And so that's one of the things, is trying to figure out what do we actually need to have in the design box, because a lot of people who design learning environments get pretty good at it, but it's this very sort of like feel their way into it. They're sort of naturally good at kind of explaining stuff, which is how they got tapped in the first place.
Right.
And sort of through a series of trial and error, they kind of develop a really tacit kind of practice where they're trying, they're mostly doing good things, but they can't necessarily say how or why they make the decisions that they make. And that makes it very difficult to then translate that for new people coming into the field, or to really kind of raise it to the next level. Because when it's all sort of, well, this is just, this just feels like a good thing to do, you can't really then take that and fine tune that very well, because it's not explicit. It's this tacit practice of this seems like a good thing to do. And also, I think people plateau. They hit a point where they're like, okay, I can deliver information competently. That must be kind of the sort of fundamental, thing that I'm doing in my job, and I'm going to stay in this. I'm going to stay in this comfort zone, which isn't really a criticism. I mean, that's a very natural kind of thing to have happen to people, but I do think learning and development needs to move beyond the information delivery model, and I think there's a whole bunch of reasons why we've been kind of stuck in the information delivery model, but we are going to find that information delivery isn't as valuable as it once was. A friend of mine does design work with museums and libraries, and he's a space designer and architectural designer, and he was saying that museums and libraries have had this real sort of question in the last 10 years or so, because their role used to be as containers of information. If you needed something to look up something, you go to the library. If you wanted to find out about historical information, you go to the museum. Well, all of that information now exists on a little device we carry around in our pockets. And so if the museums and the libraries aren't fundamentally containers of information, then what is their role? what's their function, and they're finding out that it's things like experience design, creating interesting experiences so that people can get really the feel of what it was like in 1906 as opposed to just sort of factual information about 1906. And libraries have a much more sort of interactive role about being access points for people or things like that. I think we're going to hit a really similar question in learning and development, because as content strategy gets better, as things like wikis and other kinds of informal learning environments get better, and as we generally, kind of those technologies start to evolve, the ability of taking a bunch of messy content and putting it into kind of a nice format and then projecting that out, via your rapid authoring tool of choice, that ability is going to be increasingly kind of less interesting, because that information is going to be being handled on, in different ways. And so if we're not adding value to that process, if we're not doing more than kind of an information delivery model, if we're not developing skills or creating interesting practice environment or creating kind of visceral experiences for people or doing, really kind of being able to impact behavior change, if we're not doing some of those kinds of things as a profession, then we're going to find ourselves, not terribly relevant going forward. And we're not there yet, but I think that that's going to happen.
In my organization, a work friend of mine, because he knows computers and he's a nice guy, he just was made an instructional designer. So I'll be buying another copy of your book and sending it to him.
Yep.
And in a former company, not the one I'm in now, but a former, I actually heard a vice president say, "Why is it taking so long to hire an instructional designer? Anybody can use PowerPoint."
Well,
Right.
there was an old Dilbert cartoon where Dilbert says, "Well, I'm going to change my career. I think I'm going to become a multimedia expert." And then you see him walk off the stage. He comes back in a bathrobe and says, and it said 3 hours later, he goes, "I'm now a multimedia expert." and I was sitting, that was about, I don't know, somewhere in the late 90s. And I was laughing at going, it's a sad truism to that. Because a lot of people and he just goes, "Yep, that's my new one, multimedia expert."
Yeah.
And, if you can use the TV remote, you're a multimedia expert.
Well, for us, we have a talent management strategy and succession planning, and so some of that enters into decision making. But yeah, it's going to be kind of hard. He didn't like it when I said to him last week, "You realize you have a lot to learn in a very short time because, oh yeah, we're doing a merger." He said, "Right, I know." I thought, "No, you really don't know yet."
Well, and that's I think that there's actually a couple of things that are playing into that perception too. Everybody sort of, certain fields, everybody feels like they get to have an opinion. Everybody feels like they get to have an opinion about the work a graphic designer does. I don't think that the logo should be that big, or I think it should be more blue, or it should be jazzier. Despite the fact that a graphic designer has put, an enormous amount of kind of thought and art and, craft into a design that they create, everybody sort of feels like they get to have an opinion. And that's fair because there's a subjective element to it. But the same thing happens to instructional designers. Everybody thinks they know how learning works and how learning environments should work because they've experienced them. Well, you don't want somebody who's experienced brain surgery to then go and do brain surgery, but the amount
like the TV
of
commercial.
Yeah, the amount of explicit practice, and by practice I mean, our kind of our core, the things that you need to learn in order to be an instructional designer, because so much of that is tacit, it's not obvious to people. And so therefore we kind of have a credibility problem. People don't perceive what we do as hard because, it's just, if we do it well, it looks easy, right? If we're good at it, it just sort of naturally seems like it should have always been in this format. And, the amount of work that goes into getting it there and the amount of kind of thinking and strategy and all of that kind of stuff can be really sort of invisible to people. And so that's a little bit of a challenge. I also think our other big problem is we have a broken feedback loop in the field, but that's a little bit of a separate issue.
Well, it's interesting because if you look at video editors, Now, they have a whole different world of pain they have to go through because everybody watches TV and movies. So
Yep.
we have it bad in e-learning, but when you do video, then everybody's Spielberg who looks at your video and they go, can you add the multitude of like enemy armies right to that? For, like for the $5,000 budget we have.
Yep.
And they all think it's easy. It's a lot of work. If you look at the credits on any movie, you see a lot of people, and 100 sometimes, maybe even more. And people go, really? You need that many people to just film a movie? Well, yeah, considering nowadays half of it's CG and everything else. But e-learning's the same way. There's usually a team of more, well, depending, but at least, maybe not in the corporate world as much, but in many places, especially vendor houses, you've got a team. There's at least 3 to 8 people working on a project. And they don't see that. They just see the end result, or they see the beginning and assume just one person did it all.
Well, for instance, I select images and put them in things. No one has any concept of how long it took me to select
It's
images
tedious,
that they love.
and that's tedious. It's not just that, it's selecting images, and audio is even worse.
Yep.
You're looking for the right audio or recording voiceover, and then they choose. I've had this happen a couple of times. They'll choose a voice. We give them 5 samples, and then we record everything. They get it. It's finished, and they go, we don't like that voice. That's the voice you guys
listen
chose.
To the sample.
But now we decided, no, we don't like it. We have to redo it all. Oh.
Yeah.
They pay for it, but still, it's like, really?
Yeah, but then you run the risk of not having repeat business as a consultant, or
Yeah.
in my world, in corporate world, there's big risks of having projects that are less than acceptable on some
Sure.
levels. So yeah, it's always a gamble. We want to go back. Me and Lisa and the chat pod want to go back to the broken feedback loop. If you want to delve into
sure.
that a little bit, Julie.
Yeah, no, this is actually, if I had to pick one single thing that I think is probably our biggest issue in e-learning, it's this one. And it's interesting because I've been working on this kind of serious manifesto project and a serious e-learning manifesto, and which I think is good because we have this sort of lack of design guidelines. And so anything we can do to sort of fill in the design box, I think, is useful. And my impression is that, most bad e-learning isn't because people don't care, and it isn't because they don't want to do better work. It's because of a lot of constraints that are put on them, either time or expectations. And so we're trying to kind of figure out ways, how can we help sort of fill in some of this design guide, some of these design guidelines and some of this practice. But honestly, that effort, I think, is secondary to something else that I've been trying to figure out or trying to understand, which is our sort of evaluation problem. One of the ideas behind kind of mastering any discipline is this idea of kind of extensive, deliberate practice. So if you've read, Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers book, or, there's Talent is Overrated, there's this whole 10,000 hour rule idea that and I think the 10,000 hour number is kind of a placeholder. It's, nobody knows exactly what the number is, and it probably depends. But the idea that you need a lot of deliberate practice to get really, really good at something. But one of the key elements to that deliberate practice is that you're getting feedback and then adjusting your performance as you go forward. So Tiger Woods is a master at golf because he's not only because he's practiced for 10,000 hours, but because he was getting a lot of coaching feedback. And quite frankly, when you play golf, you get a lot of immediate feedback just from the act of playing the game, where if the ball, gets on the green or doesn't get on the green, or if the putt goes in or it doesn't go in. You're getting a lot of feedback on your performance in that, and then he gets expert coaching besides that. As people become e-learning people, and as they practice and as they work, right now they're not getting nearly enough feedback on the things that they're doing to help inform their practice as they go forward. If a lot of people who do e-learning stuff have also done classroom teaching, not everybody, but a number of people. And at least in a classroom environment, when you're teaching something, you find out pretty quickly if it's working effectively as a classroom experience or not. Did people understand the instructions? No, I have to explain it differently next time. Did people, seem to get the example that I was giving? Did they do the activity right? Did they, you get a ton of feedback when you're teaching a live class. Now, what you don't usually get when you're teaching a live class is what do they actually do when they get back out to their jobs? But in e-learning, you're not even getting that immediate kind of classification of feedback. When I do talks on this, I ask people in the room, how many of you regularly or even, moderately frequently get to see people using the things that you built? So if you're making e-learning, how many of you actually get to see somebody using the e-learning that you built? And I usually get less than half of the room raising their hands, which actually I think is pretty good. I would have actually been more pessimistic about it. Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of shocking if we really think about it. I am building stuff and I am throwing it over the wall and I don't really know if it's working or not. And I've certainly done projects where that's been the case. For whatever reason, the constraints of the project are such that I don't get any kind of information back. And we also have sort of unfortunate technology standards like SCORM, which basically give you 3 little pieces of information back, which user scores, a completion status, maybe time on task. But that's kind of like looking at, watching your user's behavior through a drinking straw. You get a tiny sliver of the information that you would want to have about what they're doing or what their experience is.
Well, the SCORM measures we use aren't even what it was designed for. So.
No, and
Exactly.
and Julie, one thing you bring up, which I started realizing when we were doing the e-learning manifesto show, that one thing that's real interesting, we're really teaching people like we teach dogs. And think about at the end of a quiz, it's like, good job, well done, have a seat, sit down, roll over, very well, good job. And it's kind of like a Pavlovian response over. So if they're drooling, hey, this is good. They're salivating. We've done our job. This is great. But like you and Michael Allen were saying is, we're not really giving them any valuable feedback. We're just saying, good job, well done, nice. But what does it mean? What does it really mean?
Yeah, so the users aren't getting particularly effective feedback, but then really we as designers are not getting good feedback either.
True.
Which means that even though I've been doing this for many, many years, in a lot of cases, this is just kind of my opinion that this is a good practice to do. Now, I think my opinion is probably pretty good. I have a lot of experience in this, and I have actually at least been able to see quite a few people use the things that I've built and gotten, kind of more feedback, because that's something that's really important to me, and I try to figure out ways to do it. But, one of the issues with that, one of the things that I've been talking kind of a lot lately about is the notion of sort of guerrilla evaluation. What's the quickest, dirtiest, cheapest, and easiest way that I can get some feedback coming back to me about what's going on? Because obviously we've been talking about like the Kirkpatrick levels and level 3 and 4 evaluation for decades, and it's still not really happening very often. It's still not really working the way we need to.
Is it true because we don't ask?
I think it is, yeah.
I think part of the time we don't ask because we don't want to hear, and part of the time we know that asking for feedback means we're going to have to rework, and we don't have the luxury of time with the rework. Or, my recent experience at Learning Solutions is there are people that have technical expertise in doing design, but they don't even know how to ask questions like that. So sorry to interrupt you, but that's my question to you. How do we fix that feedback loop?
Well, and if one idea, and I think this came out of a conversation I had with Kathy Moore about some stuff, but like if you say called up 6 people who had taken your course a month or 6 weeks after they take the course, and you just talk to them about their experience. You say, what do you remember? Can you answer a few questions? Are you using any of this? If you are using it, how's that working for you? And if you just did that, which you could do in an afternoon, if you just did that and had short conversations with some people who were, took your class, would that provide you useful feedback going forward? And that's sort of what I'm talking about with like kind of the minimum level of effort. Because we don't do level 3 evaluation, which is this sort of behavior change stuff, because it's big and it's scary and it's expensive. And frequently what we really need to be able to do it is to have organizational metrics in place. So I've seen it work with sales organizations because they're already collecting a lot of performance metrics anyway in the form of, sales conversions and sales numbers and things like that. And I was talking to somebody who has a coffee. He works for one of the coffee retail chains that I won't say which, but they already capture a lot of organizational metrics anyway. They know their number of customers served per hour in every cafe, and they know their customer satisfaction ratings, and they know, they have a lot of productivity numbers. They have a lot of data that they already know about what people are doing, and it's not that hard to do evaluation in those environments because there's already a feedback loop, and then they just need to kind of use it for their purpose. So if they roll out a customer satisfaction training, they can do A/B testing. They can roll it out to 50 stores and see if the customer satisfaction numbers go up compared to 50 stores where they didn't roll it out. But in the absence of an organization actually collecting those metrics, it's really incredibly hard for a learning and development group to get any kind of foothold in terms of actually getting real data back in terms of how effective are their interventions. And so the question is not necessarily how can we prove that the training works, because quite frankly, if the organization isn't set up to figure that out, I'm not sure that there's much that learning and development people can do. But the question is, how can I as a practitioner get some kind of feedback, even if it is qualitative, even if it is anecdotal, get something coming back into my practice so I can do better next time.
Well, I think that is so imperative. If we want to improve in our work, we have to do that. So informal or formal, do something. I think what happens, at least historically, with people I've known for over 20 years doing this work, the other reason they don't ask the questions or bubble that information up is because there's always blowback. Well, see, you guys don't know how to create better projects. Well,
right.
You see, we told you you didn't, and now it's true.
A friend of mine, a guy by the name of Carl Fast, who's a professor at Kent State in user experience design and information architecture, knowledge management, that kind of thing, talks about whether you fundamentally in his organization have a right versus better framework. And right is, it has to be the right answer. And you're an expert, so you should know the right answer. And if you don't know the right answer, then you're wrong, basically, or it's your fault. It's kind of a way of setting up blame. Now, anytime somebody tells me you're the expert, we'll do what you say, or you're the expert or something, I'm like, oh, okay, that's not the right framework. Versus better, which is everything that we do is essentially an experiment, and if it's better than what we were doing before, we'll do more of it, and if it's not better, we'll do something else. And better is a much lower blame kind of environment, right. Because everybody acknowledges that the world is complicated and it is incredibly hard to predict how well things are going to work. But that if you can, try something, get some feedback, and adjust, that you're going to get much closer to good performance than if you're kind of guessing. It's sort of agile versus like traditional big enormous project management. And big enormous project management, if you kind of estimate all the tasks out in the project and the amount of time it'll take, and it's not something that you have a ton of experience with, it's a new type of project, the answer is you're going to be wrong. Whereas, and of course you're going to be wrong, and of course it's going to take longer, and of course it's going to be, there's going to be problems with it, and of course it's going to have overruns and all of these kinds of things. Whereas Agile sort of just admits that that's going to be the case and keeps the time frame down to, can we reasonably predict the amount of work we can get done in 2 weeks, and can we reasonably kind of work towards a particular goal in a short-term frame? And the answer is, yeah, probably. So let's try to do that, and then we'll adjust from there, and we'll adjust from there. And so what I'm kind of advocating is a little bit more of an Agile approach to evaluation, because then there's much less ego involved. Like, you could try something small, and if it completely is wrong, everybody goes, oh, okay, well, now we know that, and then they move on. But it's not anybody's fault. But when you do big, enormous efforts that everybody's staking their reputation on, then you get into this position where nobody can afford to actually collect the data that says it didn't do anything, because, heads will roll. And so as long as we're in this kind of blame-based, it has to be right environment, we're going to be creating circumstances where we're not measuring, or where we can't afford to collect data, or things like that. But if you can, and I think it's a painful shift. I mean, I think there's a big shift to switch from a right to a better kind of framework. But ultimately, better is that sort of successive approximation moving you towards, good performance. There's an experiment that they do. And they've done it with kids, they've done it with senior executives, they've done it all these kinds of things where they have people build towers out of marshmallows and spaghetti. So
I
you have,
love that
like,
activity. I've done it many times.
yeah, you have uncooked spaghetti and you have marshmallows, and you have to try to build the tallest tower you can. And they've done it with like grade school kids, and they've done it with like senior executives. And the grade school kids are way better at it than the senior executives are, because the senior executives will sit down and start to plan and create a committee and figure out whose roles are, and then plan the whole thing out. And then when they try to build it, it doesn't work, and then they don't have any time left to like do stuff. Whereas kids
somebody's
will
got
just
to be
start,
a leader too, right?
yeah, exactly. Whereas kids will just, start trying stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't work, they'll try something else. And if it doesn't work, they'll try something else. But they just jump right in and start kind of prototyping. And they are usually much more successfm than the people who are trying to plan the whole thing out and engineer it from the beginning. And so that's kind of the model that I'm kind of advocating, or trying to figure out how can we move towards, is let's try stuff, let's get some feedback. And it's hard. There's a real discipline to doing, say, agile development as opposed to kind of traditional project management. And a lot of people do what I think is kind of fake agile. It's sort of cargo cult agile.
Right.
And I think that I don't think this is necessarily an easy switch to make, but there are ways we can kind of move towards it. And we will only be better as a field if we can kind of move towards an environment where we're actually getting real feedback, because people can go years in this field without getting any really substantive feedback on the work that they're doing. And of course they feel helpless, and of course they feel like they're not able to kind of have credibility within the organization or get people to listen to them, or whatever, because they don't have this sort of demonstrable proof. And even if it's something like user testing your e-learning, I come from a kind of dual instructional design user experience background, and so I come from a background where user testing stuff is really important, because you assume essentially that your design is going to be flawed and that you're going to have to find the issues with it by testing it with users and then refining it. And it doesn't have to take more time, but it does involve a shift in kind of how you think about things.
One of the keys in project management is at the end, this is where it really counts. You have praise you have blame for of the innocent, and praise for the non-participants. Mm-hmm. That's the whole key. If you look at most corporations, everybody in between is getting shot at, and everybody who's not involved gets the praises. So it's kind of an interesting approach. That hasn't changed much in who knows how many years.
Well, continuous process improvement, I've always felt like that is the best model. We're saying, what you're saying, Julie, is we're better and improving. That there's no end to this. There's only the next phase of it. And we'll try to get it even better next time. So if we would go back to some of our roots, I think we'd be fine. Yeah.
Now, Dawn, any questions? We're about out of time. Any questions from the chat room?
It got real quiet in the chat room. So the whole thing about the feedback loop was hot and heavy with Lisa and I and a few others. So thanks for doing that with us. I think we always need reinforcement on and about doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's one of those things where, I'm not interested in sort of blame or shaming anybody into stuff. I just, I want to figure out how. There's a great guy who does a lot of sustainability design research. His name is Dan Lockton, and he talks about not treating people as the problem, but treating their problem as the problem. So, if people aren't recycling, you don't try to shame them into recycling. You try to figure out, how can I make recycling easier for you? So is the bin across the floor, or can we put one next to your desk? Okay, great. We'll put one next to your desk. So, I think that's my kind of viewpoint about almost everything, is how can we figure out ways to make things work better for people so that they can be more productive and so that they can do more things. And how do we create environments where they're getting the feedback that they need in order to be able to improve in a non-judgmental way. So
that's great. Now, Julie, we are at the end of our show here. How can people reach you?
I am at usablelearning.com. I'm also on Twitter at usablelearning. You can find me at either one of those places. Those are probably the best places to reach me at this point. So.
Okay. And your Twitter is actually USAB Learning, correct?
It's Usable Learning, all one word, and it's
okay.
USABLE. Yeah. So there's usable with USE and USA, so it's USA.
Got it.
Well, good. I spelled it right earlier. Great.
Yep. Yeah, just wanted to make sure. That sounds good. And how, just before we wrap up, how's the Serious eLearning Manifesto going?
Yeah.
It's going well. I mean, a lot of people have been really responded to it very enthusiastically. Some people are kind of, the critiques that have come through are things like, well, this isn't necessarily new, or, we've heard this in other places. And I think that that's true. I mean, I think what we were trying to do is kind of act as aggregators and get a kind of single place where we could start to collect some of these design guidelines. I talk about the design box being kind of like, and magic happens here. This is just one little contribution towards trying to create some centralized design guidelines, especially for people who are newer to the field, and also giving people some ammunition that they can use as pushback in their own organizations when they're being asked to cut corners or being asked to do things faster than is reasonable to expect. That's my big hope, actually, is that it's useful in that way for people. So,
okay, great.
But lots of people have signed up. There's been a lot of enthusiasm about it, so we're excited about that.
That's good. Any conferences you're going to?
Yes, let's see. I think the next one that I'm actually doing is a small conference in Portland. It's Blue Volt it's the Leap Ahead conference, and that's going to be in the end of June. And then there's going to be an Experience API event in Chicago over the summer. I have to actually go back and check the dates because that one just got released. So anybody who's interested in Tin Can or the Experience API, there's going to be a small event there that really is going to be kind of more of a workshop style conference where people, it's kind of an unconference format. And then I will be at the Training Magazine event, Online Learning in Chicago in September. Right, ICE. ICE is the big one that's coming up.
Okay. I was going to say, am I seeing you in 2 weeks?
I skipped right over that one. That one's in the first week in May in DC. So
it's May 3rd, 4th, 5th, I think.
Yes. I'm teaching the pre-conference workshop on advanced instructional design for eLearning over the weekend, and then the conference runs from Sunday to Wednesday, I think.
Sunday afternoon. Sunday at noon. Yeah.
That's good. Yep. Well, Julie, we really appreciate you being on today and sharing with us and the audience. I think a lot of good stuff today.
Good.
All right. Great. Thanks, everybody.
And good luck at ICE. I'm actually not going to ICE either, so I won't see you there. Are you going to eLearn by any chance?
I'm not doing eLearn. I'll probably, I will in all likelihood be at DevLearn in the fall.
Okay,
but
I'll probably see you at DevLearn.
The Guild events, but
sounds great.
But not eLearn, so.
Well, Julie, again, appreciate you having you on, and people know how to get a hold of you. And Dawn, thanks for being on today.
Yeah, I'll be here next week too.
And we'll see you next week, and Skype willing, everything is good.
Yeah, well, great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
See you soon, Julie. Thank you so much.
And for you guys in the chat room, thanks for being there, but don't be so quiet. And if you're watching the recording, please subscribe and let us know what you think. Have a good one, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.